If we want to draw buildings that look realistic, almost without exception, the most important thing is that the overall perspective of the general building shape is correct. Let me show you the difference it makes. And let's put our chimney on top. Now, I don't know whether this looks particularly wrong to you or not. It partly depends what we're used to looking at. But let me draw something as similar as I can, with the perspective being a lot more accurate. Whatever you thought of the realism of the shape of the first building, I hope you're thinking that the second shape building does have a more realistic looking feel to it. Now, it's not in this video to explain how perspective works, except to say that perspective is the way something looks when we view it from a particular place. When we change position, whatever we're looking at will change shape according to where we're looking at it from next. And the way different shapes change when the position we view them from changes follows certain patterns. And if we come to understand those patterns, it makes it much easier to see when we're actually observing our subject exactly what the changes are. If you're interested in more on perspective, I have a playlist of over 150 videos. One of the patterns is that as horizontal lines get higher from where our eye level is, the angle increases. These two lines are parallel. This top line should have a steeper angle as the angle fans out. But all of these lines should meet at the same point, and clearly this line and this line are not going to meet, but all of the lines should also meet at the level of our eyes, and clearly this line and this line are not going to do that. Whereas in this quick sketch, the angle of this line increases with this line, increases with this line, and the same thing happens on the other side. So we get this fanning effect. And the chimney has been drawn with a straight line across the top, because that's often how we see chimneys. But from this position looking up, the horizontal lines at the top of the chimney follow the same patterns as the horizontal lines on the sides of the building. So if we want our buildings to look realistic, then we have to get the fundamentals of the perspective, of the basic shape of the building, and of the major divisions of the buildings, such as the different levels, correct. The second important tip, if we want our buildings to look realistic, is also connected with perspective, but it's to do with the perspective of details, and particularly the details as they spread across the horizontal faces of our architecture. And it's because of the principle that as an object moves further away, it becomes smaller. Now, it becomes smaller vertically, and we can see that because as this wall moves away, it actually becomes shorter. And it's shorter where it's furthest away than where it's closest. And that happens on both sides. But as well as happening on the vertical, this happens on the horizontal. And this makes objects that are on the wall, such as windows, seem narrower as they move further away. And not just do the windows become narrower, but the gaps between them become narrower. If we have a row of columns, the columns seem to become closer as the wall moves further away. Let me add some windows onto our first building without any great regard for how foreshortening is going to work. And quite apart from the fact that our windows are probably too large for the size of our wall, they've also been drawn without regard for the perspective rules that they should follow, both on their horizontal lines, but particularly in this case, on their vertical lines. Let me show you the difference drawing them with the correct perspective makes. A really good way to show the impact of foreshortening, of the narrowing of objects as they move further away, is always on a given area to show the halfway point. And in a rectangle, we get the halfway point by drawing the diagonals. So here we have the halfway point of this wall, and as you can see, it's not halfway along this line, which would be more about here, but it's further towards the far end of the wall. If we look at this wall, which is angled away more sharply, and therefore this wall moves away further, faster, we see the same thing, that the halfway point is actually much further along the halfway point of these. Now we can do this again, and we can get the halfway point of the halfway point. And what we can see is each quarter becomes narrower as it moves further away from us. And the same thing on this side. Now, any horizontal lines, which includes the top of the windows, need to follow this same fanning out pattern. And so if we want to place windows within our walls, then this is a framework which will give us a much more accurate perspective with those windows than we have in our first one. And so we get something that looks more like this, where our windows follow both the horizontal perspective theory of all joining up on our eye level, but they also follow the vertical perspective principle of foreshortening, where as they move further away from us, they become narrower and narrower. The third way we can make our drawings look more realistic is to add what I call the depth line. Three-dimensional objects have height and breadth and depth. And while paper is only two-dimensional, we can still draw the third dimension, the depth line. But so often I see drawings of buildings where that hasn't taken place. Now, that might be as simple in a drawing such as this as adding the depth for the windows. So now we can see the thickness of the walls. Now, because we're looking up, the higher up we go, we can start to see more of this underneath section. So now our wall has thickness, or our windows have depth, whichever way we like to look at it. And our windows, which are just single lines drawn onto a wall, are starting to look more cartoon-like. But even between these windows and these windows give this side of the building a much more realistic look. So let's give that same look to the rest of the building before we leave. But adding a depth line to something such as a window can mean a very different thing depending on the scale of our drawing. Let's take a window similar to many I see drawn on the sides of buildings. How might this be drawn if we're thinking more about depth lines? One of the most significant things about depth line is that they give us places to catch shadows. And of course, we get to choose how much trouble we want to go to with various hatching techniques for shade and shadow. But we have no options when we have no depth to catch those shadows, or in fact to put those hatching lines on. So drawing the elements of our building in a way that captures their three-dimensionality is a really important way to give them a sense of reality. For our fourth tip for drawing realistic buildings, we need to stop looking at our building and look downwards for a moment. Often when we're drawing a building, we like to define the overall shape. When we go to add the details of the front of the building, we have a problem, because in fact the building does not present a straight edge along the bottom. There are parts that come out, there are parts that go back in. Some of them are large parts that protrude, such as the central portion of the wall, but sometimes they can be as subtle as a door frame. Sometimes they can be simply parts where the brickwork comes out to provide a buttressing effect to help strengthen the wall. But what is usually not helpful is to establish a thick, heavy, straight line along the ground at the start. This is a drawing I did for a drawing demo a few days ago. And we can see how, in fact, by not actually committing to a line across the bottom, I've been able to suggest all the ins and outs of this facade, whether it is structural elements of the building or whether it is more subtle things such as simply a step into a doorway. And instead of having a thick, heavy, straight black line down here that would draw attention but also fight against the three-dimensionality of the building above it, we're able to draw down here, in fact, with a lighter touch, with a less defined technique, which lets the attention focus on the fancier, more decorative, more interesting parts of the building higher up, and yet still give the effect of realism. Sometimes drawing less detail makes something look more real. If we look at this drawing of a row of shops on a fairly steeply downhill sloping street, it would have been tempting to have drawn a straight line to represent where the street hit the footpath. But in fact, there were all sorts of minor parts coming out and going in, buttresses surrounding doorways or decorative columns at the edge of the building properties, as well as going into doorways, and all of these created a fairly jagged tooth-like effect. Again, my technique is to draw these areas very lightly at the start, talking of course of drawing directly in ink. And what I'm likely to do is do a series of dots or dashes that lets me play around with creating this jagged, toothy effect at ground level. It's also helpful when there's street furniture of some description in front of the base of our facade, which is very common if we like urban sketching. It's another reason why it's helpful not to draw this line in too early, because then, in fact, we can draw whatever's in front and then we can add behind whatever details we need, creating a far more naturalistic effect at ground level. So when we're drawing, we need to pay particular attention at ground level. Maybe give some indications with dots of where we think our lines are going to go, and then draw them slowly, briefly, in small sets. And being careful not to draw them too slowly and therefore deposit more ink there and make the lines heavier and more obvious. Because very, very seldom will we want the attention to focus down here. Almost always, we're looking at something higher up than ground level. So pay particular attention to where the building hits the ground and the very irregular lines of contact that it creates. And this next tip for drawing more realistic buildings is also a case of sometimes less is more. Say we're drawing a cottage. Here's our stone cottage. I see many, many drawings of buildings where the artist has had some of the dilemmas that show themselves in a drawing such as this, where the sheer complexity of the detail of so many bricks and so many tiles becomes overwhelming, and where they start to draw them but then don't know where to stop. And because in most buildings, this detail is quite complex because every row of stone or brick needs to follow the perspective angles, and because the way stones and bricks are laid to create certain patterns, it becomes a harder job than just the sheer number of lines that have to be drawn. And because there are so many lines that have to be drawn, it's hard to maintain the same attention and discipline for all of them What I often see happening is where the lines are meant to be vertical, as they move to one side, they start to slope. And I suspect this is where the artist gets tired of moving their hands and they're resting their hand on the paper and they start to cramp, which naturally tends to put a slant on the line. It also becomes very time consuming if we're drawing all of the divisions between the bricks and stones to line them up so that we don't have joins directly above each other, which of course is the whole point of the way the bricks are laid. We see here that the perspective angles don't always line up with how they should be, and the sheer number of lines that trying to draw all the bricks and tiles ends up creating becomes the overwhelmingly major thing we see. We don't see the cottage so much. We see a massive lattice work lines, and if it weren't for the chimneys on top, it would be even harder to know what they were showing us. So how do we draw such a subject realistically? The reality is that in real life, when we look at a building that's made of bricks or stone or has tiles, we get a sense of there are bricks there, but we do not see all of the bricks all at once. We see a small area where we might see the bricks in detail, and then we presume they're everywhere else. As we shift our eyes across our subject, where that patch of brickwork that we see in detail will change. But we never are aware of all of the bricks all at once. That's too complex for our eyes and our brain to take in. So here we have what for me is my, if you like, solution to the problem of drawing tiles and bricks and stone. Firstly, you'll notice that these stones, they are stones, they're not bricks, but they're much smaller than here. It's often very difficult to create the right scale when we're trying to draw every stone or brick, because that just creates too many lines. You'll see I haven't tried to draw them all. I've tried to suggest the horizontal lines that represent the courses of stonework, and I've thought about and drawn them really quite separately then to draw in some horizontal lines. And some of the horizontal lines, here, over here, over here, reflect the joins between bricks or stones. And some of them are actually reflecting the darker colour of just a few bricks. And that's quite a useful thing to do, because my brain sees these and goes, oh, they're bricks or they're stones. There's some sort of stony brick thing that's that size that this cottage is made of. And I've done the same thing with the slate roof. I've drawn just enough lines, both horizontally and vertically, or at a 45-degree angle in this case, to suggest that there are tiles there. And because I've only been suggesting these tiles and these bricks, I've been able to do them lightly, and their lines don't overwhelm the lines of the building. The building's shape is still the first and the main thing that we see. Here's another scene in Edinburgh where I've done the same thing. But in this scene, we have two buildings side by side where the stonework is of a different scale. And so I've tried to reflect the fact that these stones here are larger, not just because they're closer, but because this building is made of larger stones than this one. So trying to create a sense of scale by varying the size of the elements that we do show is important. And of course, as they move further away, if they are the same size, it's important to make them smaller as they go further down. And sometimes in some drawings of some scale, depending on how large the individual stone blocks are, we may actually come close to more drawing all of them. But even then, it can be better to draw them with a light touch and only in the part that's closest to us. And as they move further away, we draw less and less detail because we still want the overall shape of the building to be the dominant thing that we see. And of course, it's not just in walls, but it's in pavers as well. So to draw buildings that look realistic, we need to make sure we keep their perspective angles correct. We need to make sure that we foreshorten as things move further away from us, that they become visually compressed to recreate the effect that we have in real life when we look at buildings that are getting further away from us. We need to draw carefully where our buildings or even things like these fences touch the ground, so that there's room for things that come in front, and there's room for parts of the scene where we have spaces, areas that go inwards, whether they're driveways or whether they're doorways. And sometimes less is more when we're drawing detail such as stonework or tiles. You'll see here I didn't actually put any line work for these tiles here. Instead, I used some tone, and I deliberately left the tone streaky in thin strips of line that I hope suggest the rows of slate tiles. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. If you've not been satisfied that your buildings look realistic enough, then can I suggest paying attention to these 5 areas. Have a look at some of the drawings that you've done already and tick off each of these 5 points and see if one or more of them are perhaps areas of weakness that in your next drawing of a building, you could change your drawing approach, your drawing technique a little bit and see if it doesn't help. But whatever you draw and however you're drawing it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.